It is mankind's fortune to exist without explanation. It is its wit to make the best or worst or nothing of it. Here's what I make of it. What is the work of mankind? To survive. What is the life of mankind? Well, either its life is identical with its work or different. If it's identical, then Karl Marx and Henry Ford are both right. Mankind's life is its work. Its satisfaction, then, lies in seeing itself reflected in its work, that is, in the success of its survival. But if its work and its life are different, then since its work is to survive, its life must involve more than surviving. What could that be? Just now we assume that mankind derives satisfaction from seeing itself reflected in its work. What other activity or state of being might it be possible to see itself reflected in other than its work? Whatever it is, it can only be peripherally related to survival because survival is work and mankind's life, we assume for the sake of argument, involves more than work. Could it possibly be that mankind derives satisfaction from not working? I don't mean not surviving, but not having to work all the time at surviving, because the work has been accomplished so efficiently that mankind has time left over to do what? To do whatever it damn feels like doing? Suppose that's how mankind's life differs from its work. That mankind's work is to derive satisfaction in accomplishing in the most efficient manner whatever needs to be done in order to survive. But its life involves deriving satisfaction at being at liberty to see itself reflected in doing whatever it damn pleases. It seems then that working is doing what you have to do. Living, doing what you are at liberty or free to do. So, to sum up, mankind's work is to survive. Its life is to use the time it saves working efficiently to do anything it damn pleases. Now, we say a person works efficiently when he or she accomplishes what needs to be done in the shortest amount of time possible, so that he or she can knock off from work early. Does it make sense to apply this definition to an entire generation? If it does, we can say that a generation works efficiently when all its members finish their work in the shortest amount of time possible, so that each can leave work early. If I assume here that the work required for everyone the world over to survive is performed cooperatively and systematically, then it's possible for everyone to knock off from work early, in the sense that the time saved is equally redistributed. The generation, then, has organized itself to accomplish its work on the analogy of being a single individual with 6 billion hands. That being the case, the idea makes sense, I think, for a generation to knock off from work early. But I spoke above of mankind. Does it make sense for mankind to knock off from work early? Let's see. Mankind I define as all the generations from first to last. Now, I say from first to last on the assumption that mankind is an individual who is born and dies, that is, which becomes extinct. So, guided by our assumption, at least until it proves absurd, that mankind is an individual, then, like an individual, mankind works efficiently so that it can retire early and enjoy a ripe old age. Already the analogy is strained. Mankind conceived as an individual is a single person without parents or offspring, whereas a generation of which mankind is composed requires preceding and succeeding generations in order to exist at all. For the young, the mature, and the elderly constitute 3 generations living at the same time in the same space. Can all 3 knock off early from work? Well, ideally, the work of the young is learning how to run the world more and more efficiently. The work of the mature is actually running the world as efficiently as they can, and the work of the elderly is teaching the young and acting as liaison between the young and the mature, and performing both functions as efficiently as they can. Since, therefore, all three perform different aspects of the same work, that is, of running the world as efficiently as possible, it seems to me not inconceivable that school time and work time can both be shortened in conjunction with each other. Hence the analogy holds. The three generations overlapping each other in space and time probably can all knock off from work early. But can we make the leap from generation to species, that is, from the succession of generations to mankind, without the analogy bursting asunder that mankind is an individual? If mankind is an individual, then, as I indicated above, like an individual, it eventually grows old, weakens, and dies. That implies a last generation. Also, preceding the extinction of mankind, any number of generations, which, because they are, for whatever reason, too feeble to survive on their own, require help. Who will help mankind in its old age? Mankind either helps itself or not at all. Hence, part of the work of the generations which constitute mankind in its prime is to provide for itself in its old age. At this point, we require numbers. Suppose we take one mankind year to be equal to 3,000 normal years. The number 3,000 is chosen to accord with the conclusion of advertisers that on the average, the mental age of consumers in the mass market is 12 years old. Well, if the species is 12 years old, then 12 times 3,000 puts the formation of human consciousness at around 36,000 BC, which coincides fairly well with the formation of spoken language and thus with the rise of consciousness. Now, continuing the comparison of mankind to an individual, if we foresee mankind dying at the ripe old age of 100, then, multiplying 3,000 by 100, we predict that mankind will die at the ripe old age of 300,000 years old. That means that if mankind's life as a self-conscious species began with the beginning of speech, and we assume that speech, as a fad which rapidly became a must if a person was to be considered human, began somewhere in the vicinity of 30,000 BC, then mankind will die in the year 270,000 AD. Therefore, we have about 240,000 years left to work out our destiny before we go out the hole. Assuming that the middle third of our collective life constitutes mankind in its prime, then mankind will flourish for 100,000 normal years, from 70,000 AD to 170,000 AD. During these years, if it is to enjoy a comfortable old age, mankind must produce as part of its survival strategy enough surplus, preserved how, I wonder, to provide for its old age. That means that during mankind's prime, the three generations of the young, the mature, and the elderly, which overlap each century, will be responsible for providing 1/10,000th of the total surplus needed to support mankind in its old age, the absolute number depending on the demographics. What happens, I hear you ask, if mankind lives over 100 years, if he dies as old as Methuselah? In that case, mankind will have a sad instead of a happy ending, but at least through no fault of its own. This, then, is the result if one takes the comparison between species and individual to its logical conclusion. I regard the comparison highly, because if mankind is a person who lives and dies, then we all share the same person, which gives us something in common to balance the unrelievable except by makeshifts confinement of each to his own or her. Then we all share the same person, which gives us something in common to balance the unrelievable except by makeshifts, confinement of each to his or her own body. But why is it that while each generation tackles with gusto the work of survival, mankind taken as a whole so far hardly has a life to speak of? The reason is, I think, because so far, generation after generation, people have contested with each other about whose life it is to be. What I mean is, everyone is aware since history began that the most efficient way of running a world, that is, of everyone surviving with the least amount of effort, is for one person or a single corporate entity to end the chaotic rivalry for mastery of the world and manage the world on behalf of everyone. The problem, however, is choosing a person or corporate entity that everyone trusts has the interest of all at heart. Most early peoples encountered each other while they were looking for new sources of food, so that immediately what they had in common was that neither had enough to eat. If they found an abundance of food, they shared. If not, they fought. Since this routine was carried out everywhere in the world, the notion came to prevail that it was not only possible but likely in the dim stretches of time that one person who was the leader of a single nation would conquer every other nation and be sole owner of all the resources of Earth. This scenario, which was played out everywhere in the world, is the true invisible hand that enforces history upon us all. It represents the only way we know to get the planet in the hands of a single entity so that the world can be run efficiently. But there's a built-in booby trap in continuing to play out the semifinals and finals of nations contending for world hegemony. History is premised on scarcity of resources. However, the wars required to determine a world champion of history requires larger and larger chunks of unrenewable resources. This despite the fact that the unit cost of inflicting a casualty on the enemy is at an all-time low. Each war, then, diminishes the value of the prize for which the leading powers contend. If ever the planet is not worth fighting over, it will be because there's not enough resources left for a winner to survive on. Also, given the destructive power of modern military weapons, conquering the planet may require destroying it. So, history has fast become a dead end for putting the planet in the hands of a single political entity. In the meantime, the strategy of the nations in determining the winner of the planet is to establish, whenever possible, a balance of power, where nations choose sides and are able to cooperate with each other so long as they equally menace each other, and so everyone fears to make a bid for hegemony. But if one nation or block of nations gains the upper hand militarily or economically, it has to make a bid to capture the planet in order to avoid eventually being superseded by another nation or block of nations. One can safely retire from a boxing career, but not from a fistfight without conceding defeat. Among the nations contending for hegemony of the planet, two supernations have emerged to rival each other for possession of the planetary resources: the nation of the rich and the nation of the poor. Historically, the rich rule the poor until the poor, uniting around a charismatic leader, overthrow the rule of the rich and attempt to rule themselves, with more or less success depending on the absence or presence of counter-revolutionary forces. To forestall revolution, the rich around the world unite in enacting policy that prevents the poor of one nation from forming alliances with the poor of other nations. Therefore, at the same time that the rich of each nation contend with each other for world hegemony, so do the global rich contend with the global poor for the same object. Whether one is a plutocrat or an ochlocracy, ochlocracy, is Aristotle's term for the lowest form of democracy, made up of workers who are too busy making a living to have time to rule themselves. The Greek term means rule by a crowd or mob and is disparaging. I like to translate it ochlocracy, O''Clockracy, which I define as ruled by clock watchers, that is, by people who sell their labor time to others in return for hourly wages. And to match the term plutocrat, I use clockrat. Now, whether one is a plutocrat or clockrat is not a moral issue. That is, one does not freely choose to be one or the other. On the contrary, membership is determined by how much money you have. If you have a lot of money, then you're a plutocrat because you are committed to protecting your wealth. On the other hand, if you have to sell your labor power daily in order to survive, then you're a clockrat and you resent the wealth of the plutocrats. Up until the publication of Karl Marx's Das Kapital in 1867, most people assumed that whether you were rich or poor was an individual matter, depending on a combination of luck, brains, and ambition. After Marx, national wealth, which he considered a unit of global wealth, was thought to be a complex unity, such that the wealth which gravitates toward the rich gravitates away from the poor. This reciprocity is obscured when national wealth increases for everyone. Then the rich and the poor of the prosperous nations both enjoy increased wealth, but at the cost of the decreasing wealth of the impoverished nations. Essential to the strategy of the plutocrats for maintaining superiority over the clockrats is garnering the favor of those of middling wealth, who I call the pseudocrats, for the reason that pseudocrats emulate the plutocrats, but must maintain good relations with the clockrats, whom they supervise. They are pseudocrats because they are neither one crat nor the other. As long as the pseudocrats do tolerably well, they insulate the plutocrats against the dissension of the clockrats. But should an economy cease to expand, but on the contrary contract, to the point where, in order to maintain their profits, the plutocrats must deprive the pseudocrats of theirs, then the pseudocrats disappear, leaving the plutocrats exposed and vulnerable to the attacks of the clockrats. The army comes to replace the pseudocratic middle classes as a buffer between the plutocrats and the clockrats. The army, however, is an expensive buffer because, unlike the pseudocrats who support themselves, the army must be funded by taxes squeezed out of the clockrats and by donations made by other plutocracies. The more diminished the middle classes, then, the more formidable and hence financially burdensome the army. Furthermore, the army is essentially made up of clockrats in uniform, who someday, upon being ordered to fire into a crowd of civilian clockrats, might unpredictably turn their weapons in the direction of their officers. Fear of military revolt significantly motivates development of remotely controlled weapons like drones. Fear of revolt also calls for merciless prosecution of whistleblowers, lest the entire army begin doing the whistle dance. In any case, when clockrats stop watching clocks and instead look through the sights of a rifle, then the o'clocratic revolution is at hand. Whether it succeeds or fails depends on whether o'clocracies around the world come to its aid, or whether the intentional plutocracia rescues the beleaguered plutocracy by helping to crush the revolt. The plutocratic policy of helping other friendly plutocracies to maintain dominance over their own respective ochlocracies has remained consistent from at least the time of the Roman Empire down to the hegemony of the United States. And the opposed policy of helping ochlocracies dominate plutocracies has remained consistent from the 5th century BC People's Democracy of Athens to the late 20th century Soviet Union. Finally, it should be noted that when ochlocracies go bad, as did both Athens and the Soviet Union, it's for the same reason that individuals who live under constant threat by people who wish them dead become paranoid and turn vicious. But that's a whole other topic.